The Liberian Exodus. An account of voyage of the first emigrants in the bark Azor, and their reception at Monrovia, with a description of Liberia, its customs and civilization, romances and prospects. The Azores' Terrible Trip. Chapter 1. Out on the deep, deep sea. 90 miles the first day. Society aboard St. James's and St. Giles's. Patience of the dusky passengers in the throes of seasickness. Provisions insufficient and of bad quality. No medical stores or stimulants. Waste and dirt. A matrimonial row. Prayers aboard. The first death and first birth. George Curtis exposed. The first storm. A scene that beggars description. The fated Sunday. Deception practiced by the Exodus Association. Measles aboard. Curtis and his wife fighting. A sudden death. And yet another. Measles quite prevalent. Forming a Sunday school. Perversity of the emigrants. Their object in leaving the South. The sixth death. 2 more. A broiling Sunday. Ship fever certainly aboard. Water running short. Half rations issued. More and more deaths. A terrible tornado. Fresh provisions all gone. Making for Sierra Leone. In port at last. Off again for Monrovia. Sierra Leone, May 30, 1878. You all know how the Azor, with her experimental load, left Charleston amid the sounds of the gospel ship is sailing and were bound for the promised land, sung from the bark's decks, and re-echoed from the Pocosin and Allison. The last sound of Charleston heard by the emigrants were the notes of the sweet by and by from the excursionists aboard the Pocosin. It is customary in letters similar to this to give over 2 or 3 pages of reflections on leaving our native land. As if anybody cared a snap what your reflections were. We aboard the Azor had our reflections, and very grave ones, on leaving our native land. We reflected whether or not we were destined to be seasick, and to what extent. Doubts on the point were speedily, and decisively decided after crossing the bar. One by one the passengers fell until, with 1 or 2 honorable exceptions, everybody was down. But surely such a good-natured and philosophical set of sick people was never before seen. The steerage passengers would each, between the intervals of his or her own attacks, laugh at, and imitate with grotesque gestures and words, some unfortunate comrade, amid the uproarious hilarity of the others. The few who were not affected seemed to witness the sufferings of their fellows with exquisite enjoyment. The hours passed thus until bedtime, when most of the passengers turned in. A few, however, preferred catching what breeze there was by sleeping on the decks. There was little application for dissatisfaction concerning the food that evening. I think most of the passengers were much disappointed in the ocean. They had evidently expected to meet with waves about 100 feet high, ornamented with piscatorial banquets of whales, leviathans, sharks, mermaids, sea cows, and all the real and mythical monsters of the deep. They were therefore somewhat disgusted at the ripples which sparkled in the sunlight in every direction, and the fish which declined showing themselves in any direction. The morning of the second day found everybody languid, feeble and disposed to fasting. Despite sickness, however, amusement could be found, for one way, in watching the arrangement of society which even so soon began to take place. The cabin passengers composed the elite, the crème de la crème. The quarterdeck composed the west end of the Azor. She was steering east, and there the foot of the plebeian who lived and moved and had his being in the lower strata of the steerage could not tread. The captain, the two mates and I, the only white souls aboard, represented those frayed ends of society ashore who are tolerated everywhere, welcomed nowhere. At 12 o'clock on Monday, April 22nd, it was announced that we were 90 miles from Charleston Bar. Having been becalmed during a large portion of the night. All traces of land had faded from sight, and I felt some curiosity to see how the sentimental, or love of home, would display itself. Careful observation, however, failed to discover an indication of either of those feelings. When the strip of mist, representing the land of these people's birth and bringing up, which contained all the memories, sweet and bitter, of their past lives, and on which their friends and kin yet remained, was fading from their sight forever, there was no development of any feeling other than a slight interest in the distance from them at which it could be seen. Every witling and witless wight who has ever been to sea has exhausted his literary abilities in describing the developments of seasickness. It is unnecessary, therefore, for the description to be gone into, especially as my appreciation of the humorous features of the performance is as yet slight. Suffice it, therefore, to say that the affliction was generally remarkably well borne. The passengers of the Azor had been forewarned, and seemed to have made up their minds to submit with equanimity. I would take this opportunity to give notice that, having been rocked in the cradle of the deep, I am prepared to sell out my stock in that article of furniture on extremely moderate terms, the subscriptions having been, very, fully paid in, and no dividends having as yet been drawn. The issuing of food and water to a system. Messes were formed among the 'tween-decks passengers, containing from 10 to 25 persons each. Some man was appointed to draw cooked provisions for each of these messes, 2 meals a day being allowed. At about 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. these provisions were taken from the general store, and cooked in the galley. One of the emigrants assisted the ship's cook each day, the African potentate engaged for that purpose having absconded in Charleston. As soon as the food was cooked, the name of the head of each mess was called from a list, and he was given prepared food sufficient for his party, which it was his duty to divide equally. The food was generally not good. There was a superabundance of meal, flour and rice, and a good quantity of meat, the latter being pork and salt beef. The flour, however, was coarse and black, and the meal seemed to give general dissatisfaction, being freely stigmatized as kiln-dried stuff, only fit for hogs to eat. The rice, too, was broken and dirty, requiring much cleaning. The meat was enough to last when carefully doled out. All of it, except 5 barrels, belonged to the 6-month stores, intended by the emigrants for their support in Liberia until the first crop is made, but it was of necessity used on the voyage. Of this matter I shall have more to say hereafter. The supply of molasses was so scant that it could only be issued occasionally as a treat. In the haste and confusion generally prevailing about the galley, the food was almost invariably ill-cooked, causing much complaint, and, doubtless, suffering, to persons whose stomachs, made delicate by seasickness, loathed the coarse and badly prepared food which might have been eaten with tolerable relish at another time under the influence of exercise and health. A significant remark was that made by one of the emigrants. "I ate a piece of that fat bacon, sir, and hung over the ship's side for 2 days." Each steerage passenger received about a full pint of cooked rice, corn and wheat bread, of each about as much as is contained in an ordinary baker's loaf, and some 2 square inches of meat at each meal. There was therefore no danger of starvation. The supply of coffee was small, rendering an extensive dilution necessary. Tea there was in plenty, but the emigrants were not generally drinkers of that beverage. What are technically known as medical comforts, consisting of small quantities of good spirits and wines, sago, arrowroot, and sea, were entirely absent. When stimulants were needed for the sick, the slender private stores of the captain or myself had to be called on. The cabin passengers, of course, fared differently. They had their meals in the forward saloon, having a comfortable table, chairs, napkins, knives and forks, while those in the steerage had nothing of the sort. The fortunate ones in the cabin had also cabin boy and steward to wait on them. Of course, the ration system did not apply to them, they partaking of their food at a general table, as at a hotel. The captain, the 2 mates and I took our meals in the after saloon, getting the same food that the cabin passengers had. Indeed, I think some of them used to watch us closely to make sure that we did not have the advantage of them either in quantity or quality of grub. Our salt beef was usually made into hash, known among seafaring folk as mystery, while our bacon was carefully boiled, cooled and sliced. We had also an occasional roast or broiled fowl, generally good biscuit or bread, butter, potatoes, codfish, mackerel, baked beans, curry, every now and then, and rice, with an invariable dessert of pies, pudding, or hot cakes and syrup. We had 2 meals a day. Other advantages that the aristocracy of the Azor possessed were pickles, vinegar, a limited supply of fresh water to wash in and a plenty to drink. There should have been a good supply of vinegar for everybody, for it would have rendered much of the food and the water greatly more palatable, but there was only a small cask aboard, and it was a scarce luxury among the people in the steerage. The latter were required to perform their ablutions in salt water, when they did perform them, and were allowed 3 quarts of the beverage per adult. From this was subtracted a sufficient quantity with which to make coffee and tea. Each adult received about 1.5 quarts a day. It was issued as early as possible in the morning. Captain Holmes tried all imaginable ways to make the food go as well as possible, having it made into general stews. Now, I expect that most of us have seen the time when rice, meat, meal and other etc., well boiled together and seasoned, would have been relished, but these people took a curious antipathy to it, and would have none of the mess. However bad the supplies may have been, it seems as if any sane person, out at sea with all the possibilities of a long voyage before him, would refrain from wasting them. Yet I've seen nearly enough bread, meat and rice which would have looked eatable enough to a starving man, thrown carelessly or angrily over the Azor's side, to feed all aboard of her for a week. On this second nautical day of the voyage, Tuesday, the good order of the quarter-deck was treated to that most cherished and relished of all things by good society everywhere, a mild scandal involving matrimonial infelicity. Among the good society aforesaid was a light-colored missionary of youthful aspect, who wore a meek expression of countenance and a tall hat. He had a wife of about his own age and color, and from the first there were indications of war between them. On this evening he summoned her to attend with him a prayer meeting in the steerage, and upon her declining, went below into the forward saloon, from whence, in a few moments, his voice came through the skylight in dismal groans and fervent prayers, to be delivered from the power of this tormenting woman. After this he rushed up, and stamping wildly about the deck, speaking bitter words of his spouse, and fiercely clutching his hair, like an Othello with the black partially washed off. This incident, of course, furnished material for much gossip and grave moralizing, and was a perfect windfall in the way of a social event. I went down to the prayer meeting and wished, for the first time, that the News and Courier was a picture paper, that I was an artist, and that the scene could have been reproduced in all of its strange picturesqueness, even were the other two conditions fulfilled. The long, low apartment, with its crowded bunks, was dimly lighted. About each of the 3 lamps, placed against the 2 hatches and the foot of the foremast, was clustered a group of men bending over tattered hymn books, and singing with full strength. From the semi-darkness around came voices of all varieties, joining in the camp-meeting refrain, while the half-dressed forms of men and women were dimly to be seen, leaning forward, listening and participating. The benches were crowded with others similarly engaged, and the children slept soundly through it all, bundled up in a wonderful diversity of ways in bed. The ladder and doors and windows of the main batch house were crowded with other faces and forms, and at the foot of the former stood the preacher. When the hymn was over, all heads were generally bent in prayer, the devotions being led either by the minister or some prominent man in the congregation, for this is but a sample of scenes often repeated. The preaching was launched into the darkness when the time came, most of the preacher's audience being invisible to him. On almost all of these occasions I was fervently prayed for, one brother revealing by a little extra plain language the probable inspiration of this portion, when he said, in tons of passionate pleading, "Bless the reporter. Oh, help him not to write any lies to thy glory, and the advancement of thy work." Though the grammatical construction of this sentence rendered it somewhat dubious, it was easy to discern its meaning. The minister brought along in charge of the A.M.E. congregation is a fair specimen of his class. I think, from close observation, that he is a man of really earnest piety, who does his best according to his lights. But the lights are so dim. He lacks entirely the education and training which many colored ministers especially in the cities possess. He seems barely able to read and write, mispronouncing the simplest words, and producing painfully ludicrous effects at the most solemn moments. With crude, twisted and half-developed ideas and reasonings on subjects, he covered up and hopelessly confused what meaning he had, with a flood of misapplied, miscalled, and confounded words.